Вітаю, друзі! Ви на каналі ЄвроSapiens з Іванною Климпуш-Цинцадзе. Всі ми знаємо, що Україна в очікуванні початку переговорів про вступ до Європейського Союзу. І знаємо, що це складний шлях, але ми його долаємо далеко не перші. Наші сусіди, країни, в яких комунізм також украв десятиліття розвитку, мають досвід, про який нам точно варто знати. Сьогодні ми розпочинаємо серію інтерв'ю з людьми, які привели свої держави у Євросоюз і вірять, що українцям теж вдасться. Та почнемо з розмови з колишнім послом Європейського Союзу в Україні паном Хюґом Мінґареллі, який і після закінчення своєї роботи в Києві вболіває за наше європейське майбутнє. І хоча в Україні пан Мінґареллі не потребує особливого представлення, для початку все ж коротка довідка. Хюґ Мінґареллі закінчив вищу бізнес-школу в Парижі, найстарішу у світі, а також французьке товариство фінансових аналітиків. Розпочав кар'єру з роботи фінансовим аналітиком. У 80-х працював у Європейському суді аудиторів, очолював аудит структурних фондів Європейського Союзу. Був головним аудитором щодо Нігерії від імені Європейського фонду розвитку, а також головним керівником-координатором з питань Нігерії у Генеральному директораті Єврокомісії з розвитку. У 90-х очолював відділ з питань нових незалежних держав Генерального директорату Єврокомісії з питань зовнішніх відносин. У 2000-х Мінґареллі очолив Європейське агентство з реконструкції та займався відновленням Чорногорії, Косово, Сербії та Македонії після війни. Після цього повернувся до Генерального директорату Єврокомісії з питань зовнішніх відносин, де, зокрема, займався Східною Європою. Після роботи у Європейській службі зовнішньої дії працював старшим радником з питань впровадження глобальної стратегії та перегляду європейської політики сусідства. До 2010-го був головним переговірником з боку ЄС з нової посиленої угоди з Україною, яка стала нашою з вами угодою про асоціацію. У 2016-2019 роках Мінґареллі був головою представництва Європейського Союзу в Україні. Зараз пан Мінґареллі – професор з питань європейської інтеграції в Паризькій бізнес-школі. Dear Ambassador Мінґареллі, I am absolutely thrilled and grateful that you found the time to talk to us here in Ukraine. Once again, share your experience. And we are very much grateful for your service here in Ukraine, for our bilateral relations between Ukraine and the EU. And also we are very grateful that, notwithstanding the fact that you are not anymore a diplomat representing EU in Ukraine, but you are continuously trying to do all your best to ensure that the support from the European Union, from all the nations of the EU, is high on the agenda for your nations to ensure that we are A, winning the war, and B, are successful in our European choice. And that is why today I would like to talk to you about your experiences with Ukraine. And definitely, as you might expect, I would like to start from your experience when you were chief negotiator on behalf of the EU, negotiating the association agreement with Ukraine. Obviously, we're right now facing different Ukraine, different EU, different geopolitical, geoeconomic setting. But what was major thing that was easy and what's difficult for you in that process? And, what were you defending then?
Thanks very much for inviting me to this exchange. And obviously, as all friends of Ukraine, I am suffering to see the tragedy that your people and your country is going through. So regarding the association agreement, we started the negotiation in 2007. And at that time, we explained to our Ukrainian partners that in this association agreement, we would have, as we have in any bilateral agreement between the EU and a partner country, three main pillars. The first one is what we call in our jargon all issues related to the political dialogue, which mean exchange of views about the political developments in Ukraine and in the EU. This is the first pillar, the political dialogue. The second one is related to all issues linked to economic cooperation and trade. And the third pillar is based on the cooperation between the EU and the partner country in a lot of sectors of the political, cultural, social, and economic life of the partner country. So we had these three pillars. On the first one, on political dialogue, it was not difficult at all because our interlocutors, the Ukrainian negotiating team, was obviously very much willing to get a text, an association, which would allow the closest possible rapprochement between Ukraine and the EU. And therefore, it was not difficult to find the right formula, such as, to give you an example, Ukraine should align with all foreign and security policy positions of the EU. With a number of partner countries, it's difficult to get such a sentence in an agreement. With Ukraine, it was very easy because our interlocutors were extremely willing to get closer to the EU. On the third pillar, cooperation in various sectors, same thing, because for everything related to people-to-people contact, cooperation in sectors such as energy, transport, everything which is related to connectivity, our Ukrainian interlocutors were very much willing to get closer to us. The most difficult element was the second pillar, economic and trade cooperation. It was difficult for the following reason. When we started the negotiation in 2007, Ukraine had just completed its negotiation to join the WTO, and Ukraine joined the WTO this year in 2007, which means that, it was no longer possible for us to propose Ukraine just a free trade area, because when a country is a member of WTO, you have already very low tariffs, barriers, very low quota, few quota, and therefore we said we cannot propose an FTA. It should not mean anything for Ukraine. And the next step in the EU bilateral agreement is generally what we call a customs union. And in customs union, the kind of agreement we have with Turkey, you have a common external tariff. But if Ukraine would have an external common tariff with the EU, Ukraine could not keep its preferential trade arrangement with Russia. And therefore, some EU member states, you can imagine which one, in Western Europe, said, no, we cannot do that. We cannot irritate our strategic partner in Russia. And therefore, we could not have a customs union. It did not make any sense to have an FTA, and therefore we invented, my colleagues of the Trade Directorate General invented this very strange thing which did not exist, a deep and comprehensive free trade area under which, in addition to removing the custom duties and the quota, we would propose Ukraine and later on to Moldova and Georgia to promote regulatory convergence, which means to propose Ukraine to align with the EU standards in a number of sectors. This way, it would be possible for Ukraine to progressively see its economy integrating the EU single market. this was what the DCFTA was about. It took some time to negotiate the DCFTA because obviously, first of all, it was very technical, and therefore it was necessary to have long discussion. And the second point is that what is at stake in a DCFTA is important for both the EU and Ukraine, because when you have really promoted regulatory convergence and you have eliminated, you have removed non-tariff barriers to trade, that trade is free in a number of sectors between Ukraine and the EU. And therefore, in the EU, a number of member states was extremely cautious to say, well, we should be careful, otherwise we will be overflowed by Ukrainian products in some sectors. And on the Ukrainian side, they had as well to think about in which sector is it our interest to remove non-tariffs barrier to trade, to align our legislation with the EU acquis, so that we can facilitate trade between Ukraine and the EU single market. And for this reason, it was really the most difficult part of the agreement in the negotiation. But I would like to say, to complete my answer on this issue, 2 points. First of all, our Ukrainian interlocutors during the negotiation were all extremely motivated. I have been negotiating a bilateral agreement between the EU and a number of partner countries in Eastern Europe, in the South Caucasus, in the Middle East, in North Africa, the Maghreb region. And I must tell you that Ukraine was, without any doubt, probably with Georgia and Moldova as well, the most motivated country to get a strong bilateral agreement as a basis to a rapprochement with the EU. And therefore, we had in front of us really very positive interlocutors, and it was a very nice negotiation. Bon. But the second point is that on the EU side, there were a number of member states which were extremely cautious and which were guided by a very simple principle. We should not see anything in this agreement between the EU and Ukraine which could irritate Russia. And therefore, every time that we were using a word, a formula, which could have been interpreted as opening the door to a possible negotiation for an Ukraine membership perspective, it was finished. So these were a bit the two constraints we had. Otherwise, as I told you, we had very positive interlocutors, and the negotiation was not difficult at all because my Ukrainian interlocutors were very positive and willing to bring their country the closest possible to the European Union.
Well, thank you. Those of us who have been following the file for a long time obviously do remember how painful it was to understand that there is no clause on the possible European perspective for Ukraine in the association agreement and DCFTA. Yeah. And you are just confirming that these geopolitical concerns have been unfortunately guiding the negotiating framework that you have been receiving from the member states.
It's clear.
Was it?
Not all member states, but some member states.
Yes, I understand.
It was not the Baltic states or Poland who wanted that.
Well, this is good. We probably will get back to Poland with the current tensions in the trade. I think it's also very telling, and maybe we will dig into that issue as well. But you are just confirming that the major part of the association agreement at DCFTA was and is still very much focused on free trade. As we understand, as we are expecting and hoping that in June, the negotiating framework for Ukraine will be approved by the EU, by the European Council, we also understand that we have to prepare for having first cluster, according to the new approach, being open to us, which would be the fundamentals.
Yeah.
And that cluster that will be opened and then the last one to be closed will be getting additional weight. In that respect, obviously the political part in the association agreement was pretty tiny, right? It was very general and pretty concise. While here we are getting into much more serious workload. How relevant remains the association agreement at this particular stage for us? And whether you think it needs some update or we just have to move on to the new tasks and priorities with regard to the new negotiating framework as the already candidate country.
Okay. Alors, you are right. In any accession talks with a partner country, we have to open first the first cluster, which we call the fundamentals. We have 33 chapters grouped in 6 clusters, and the first one to be open is the fundamentals, in which you have support to democracy, respect for human rights, rule of law, public administration, and the reform of the judiciary, all this kind of stuff, plus public financial management, financial control, statistics. But, and as I hope, as we all hope, the negotiation framework will be adopted in June, and immediately after that, there will be the possibility, we hope, to start the negotiation. With, obviously, the negotiation on the fundamentals. But I believe that at the same time, it would be Ukraine's strong interest to continue the negotiation of the association agreement, of the implementation of the association agreement, in particular, the deep and comprehensive free trade area. Because if you manage to really take over the acquis in the sectors covered by the DCFTA, you get the Ukrainian economy in the EU single market. And this would be extremely important for Ukraine because, as you know, the EU has been negotiating with the Balkan countries for a lot of years. It was at the Thessaloniki summit in 2003 that the EU decided that to grant the Western Balkans a membership perspective. And 20 years later, the most advanced country, Montenegro, has closed 3 chapters out of 33. And therefore, many people in the Balkans say, but after 20 years, after 2 decades, how can we convince our people that it is still in their interest that we continue to negotiate accession to the EU? This is what we call the Balkans trap. And therefore, it is important to avoid to get Ukraine in this Balkans trap, which means that we have to promote what people call now gradual integration. When Ukraine takes over part of the acquis communautaire, Ukraine should be allowed to participate in some EU policies and to benefit from some EU funding instruments. And the first step, in my view, should be for Ukraine to join the single market. Because if you manage to join the single market, there will be, without any doubt, quickly a very positive impact on the Ukrainian economy and on the level of, on the living condition of the Ukrainian population, which is the most important. And therefore, my strong recommendation would be start the negotiation on the fundamentals cluster, but continue, and if you can, accelerate the implementation of the DCFTA, which is included in the association agreement. And in this regard, for instance, it would be very important for Ukraine to move ahead as quickly as possible on what we call in our bureaucratic jargon, ACA, the agreement on the certification acceptance. Because if you manage to move ahead on ACA, you will facilitate to a great extent the free trade on industrial products between Ukraine and the EU. And for Ukraine, this would be, I believe, very, very important. So start the negotiation quickly at the end of June, beginning of July on the fundamentals. But on this, you know what you have to do. Democratic institution, rule of law, blah, blah, blah. You have already roadmaps on all this. And in parallel, you accelerate the implementation of the DCFTA.
We both remember how long Ukraine has been knocking on the door to actually have this ACA finally signed and getting into force, at least in small parts of the industrial sector. So do you think that the approach of the EU has changed at this moment, and the EU is going to be more ready to move faster on that track and help Ukraine wherever it's necessary to proceed on that particular track?
Well, we should not be naive, and it's clear that the EU will continue to take care of its own interest, as we have seen recently with the exception of customs duties and quota in some sectors under the pressure from the farmers, for instance. Some customs duties will be reintroduced when a certain cap has been overcome. But as we know, the geopolitical situation has changed. And if you would have told me 2 years ago that Ukraine would be an EU candidate country, I would have told you, but you are crazy. The Germans, the French, the Italians, the Spaniards will never accept that. For 30 years, they were clear about that. This was not at all on the agenda. And in June 2022, 4 months after the Russian full-scale invasion, this happened. And therefore, since the overall context has changed, you can expect more understanding and more openness from EU member states. This is how I see, how I perceive the situation. Don't expect a total opening of the EU market, but probably more openness than you had 2, 3, or 5 years ago.
Well, you've mentioned about this gradual accession and mentioned that I know that you are supporting the staged accession. From your perspective, what would be the major, so to say, low-hanging fruits for Ukraine? In which sectors at this moment we could progress faster? And you have a good knowledge of Ukraine. So what are these obvious possibilities for this gradual integration already at the earliest possible stage?
Alors, the first one is, as I said, the European single market, because we have been negotiating with you since now 2017 on this. You have in the various ministries and in the various relevant committees of the Verovna Rada competent people who know what they have to do to take over the acquis communautaire to join the single market. So this would be the first and most important one. The second area in which, in my view, you could rather quickly join some EU policies is everything which is related to connectivity, namely energy. Ukraine has been part of the Energy Community Treaty for more than 10 years now, and therefore you have already taken over a lot of the EU rules and regulations in the energy sector. And therefore, in my view, you could move ahead rather quickly. Transport and export logistics would be very important for you. And here again, you have been working for many, many years to be part of the so-called trans-European networks. And therefore, I believe that in the transport and infrastructure ministries, they know a lot about the acquis communautaire in these sectors, and they are already in a good position to move ahead rather quickly. And it would be important for the Ukrainian economy, obviously, to have in the transport sector the closest relation with the EU. Another area would be the single euro payment area to facilitate payment between banks and companies. And here again, the people of your central banks know what they have to do. Same thing with the team of Marchenko in the finance ministry. And therefore, I believe that this is an area where you could move ahead as well. There is as well, in the term of connectivity, the so-called roaming area. You know, roaming area.
We are already
voilà.
having some benefits during the wartime, though.
Voilà. And here, in my view, you should consolidate what you have got so that we can talk from Paris or Brussels to Kiev without paying anything, basically, because we are in the same roaming area. And there are other EU policies and instruments where Ukraine could try to enter, for instance, a regional policy. One of the most important funding instruments in the EU is the European Regional Development Fund, which supports what we call the regional or cohesion policy. And I believe that it would be good if Ukraine could benefit from this European Development and Regional Fund in a not too distant future to finance a lot of investment in the infrastructure in your country. So these are, in my view, the sectors on which in the next few months it should be possible to make a good progress in the negotiation so that Ukraine can join a number of EU policies and can benefit from a number of EU funding instruments.
Well, I do hope that our conversation will be heard also by governmental representatives who are forming these negotiating groups right now and are thinking of our priorities, and that could also be taken on board for Ukrainian success. But imagine if you were the person who would lead the Ukrainian negotiating team with the EU. And you would be gathering this team after finalizing all the lists for the first meeting. What would be your, I don't know, emotional, psychological, professional framework that you would suggest to the whole team before starting this pretty difficult, serious, but still hopefully very successful path?
The first point, I would clarify with my team that we talk about accession negotiation, but this is not the right formula, the wording, because there is very little to negotiate. We should talk about accession talks, to be clear, because the main objective of these talks would be for Ukraine to align its legislation with the EU norms, standards, and procedures in a large number of political, economic, and social sectors. So be aware that it's not really a negotiation. You take over. Bon. You have as well to identify the areas where Ukraine's vital interest can be at stake, so that you can negotiate transitional periods or phasing in stages. This is important to be aware on the Ukrainian side that in some sectors, maybe it's not in Ukraine's interest to move as quickly as possible towards free trade or any kind of integration in an EU policy. So try to identify these areas where Ukraine's vital interests can be at stake so that you can ask during the talks transitional periods on these areas. This is as well, in my view, rather important. The third point, unlike many other countries, the Ukrainian people who will negotiate, who will participate to these talks, will not start from scratch. Because, as you know well, the Ukrainians have already been taking over the acquis communautaire in some sectors covered by the DCFTA since 2017. And therefore, be aware of the fact that you have an advantage because a lot of people in Ukraine, in the public administration, in ministries, in Verovna Rada committees, have already some experience. Another point important, once you have identified the areas where you consider that the negotiation can be a bit difficult because the acquis, the EU acquis, is not easy to understand, ask for advice and training. The EU can provide you with technical assistance so that in areas where you need it, not everywhere, but in some areas, it might be useful to get advisors or training programs for the Ukrainian public officials who will get involved in the negotiation. This is, in my view, something which is rather important. And last point, these talks will be very technical in many sectors. We use in the EU a terrible jargon that nobody, sometimes even us, can understand. And therefore, don't hesitate when things are not clear to ask for clarification so that you know exactly what you are taking over in your legislation. Because once again, we are a bureaucracy and we have a real jargon that very few people can understand. So don't hesitate to ask for clarification whenever it is necessary. This
to ensure that you know what you are taking upon yourselves, right?
Yes, indeed. So this would be basically my first recommendations, my first reflex when confronted to these accession talks.
I think finally, this notion that these are not that much negotiations, but rather, as you were saying, accession talks and understanding that the maximum we can get, maybe it's some transitional periods or specific instruments of assistance in helping us to go through the most difficult things. It is finally kind of taking ground here. I think that that's already better and better understood, even also by the wider public, and also what's important by the politicians. But at the same time, everybody also understands that Ukraine is in pretty unique situation while we are trying to continuously transform, fighting the most brutal wars that the European continent has seen since World War II. And therefore, a lot of people are asking whether there is any potential, thinking within the EU about different scenarios of Ukraine's accession to the EU, whether any specific exceptions, exclusions, derogations would be relevant to be offered or to be accepted for Ukraine. Do you see any of this happening in the EU? Do you think that that would be relevant, that Ukraine would get, in some areas, some special treatment because of the, let's say, incredible damage to our ecology that has been made already by the Russian Federation, or to our fertile lands that will have to be demined, in thousands of hundreds of square kilometers.
It's clear that although the accession talks with Ukraine will be, as we used to say in our jargon, merit-based, because it's clear that Ukraine cannot get in until they have done their homework. It is their interest and the interest of the EU. At the same time, I don't believe that the EU can totally ignore the very specific and tragic situation in which the Ukrainian people are living. And therefore, you can expect some flexibility in some sectors from the EU. By the way, this flexibility already exists. When you look at the trade preferences which had been granted to Ukraine over the last 2 years, this is something. When you look at the so-called solidarity lanes which have been put in place, same thing. And I believe that we should continue to really take on board the very specific situation of Ukraine to be more flexible. We should as well, in my view, give far more importance than in the previous negotiation talks to everything which is related to security. This is, in my view, very, very important. It's clear that we have to find a way, and in my view, in my personal view, we should have included security in the fundamentals. Because if we do not manage to provide Ukraine with some kind of security guarantees, and the EU should be at the forefront, well, it will be difficult for Ukraine to recover. How do you want to get investment if one way or another you don't have security guarantees? And therefore, in my view, we should have a number of areas related to defense, security, and economic security as well in the early stages of the negotiation, and considered as fundamentals. For me today, security is as fundamental for Ukraine than rule of law. It's good to speak about fighting the corruption, but if you continue to get the Russian missiles,
the priority is elsewhere.
Voilà. And therefore, this is, in my view, one of the point where the Ukrainians could get something a bit different. Security in the fundamentals and flexibility when it comes to trade and connectivity, cooperation, energy, transport, digital cooperation as well, because in the field of cybersecurity, it is extremely important as well to ensure that the EU and Ukraine are together. Alors, some steps have been taken already in this regard. You know, the EU adopted, the Commission proposed a few weeks ago a new strategy for the defense industry. And in this Commission proposal, Ukraine is covered. Ukraine is part of the EU industrial defense strategy. This is something new. I know as well that the EU is negotiating as well a bilateral agreement on security commitments. Ukraine has already signed security commitments with a number of countries, including the UK, the French, and the EU is negotiating as well a bilateral agreement on security guarantees. And in my view, this should be one way or another linked to the accession talks. You cannot have this totally separated from the accession. So these are a few areas where we could adapt the accession talks to the very specific situation in which Ukraine is today.
And what do you think would be the major challenges for the EU in this negotiating process with Ukraine, as you see the EU today?
We are here in the EU now in an electoral campaign. We will have in early June the election to the European Parliament, and in Western Europe, you have already a large number of political parties who claim that it would be a disaster for the EU if one day Ukraine joined the EU. And it's not at all marginal. I insist on Western Europe. I'm not talking about Lithuania, but in Western Europe, you have a lot of, from the far right to the far left, including many countries in the so-called liberal and reformist and blah, 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 who have political leaders who say, well, if Ukraine joined the EU will just disappear. It would be a disaster for our farmers, for our steel producers, and blah, blah, blah. And therefore, an important battle that we have to fight now, the friends of Ukraine, is to explain that Ukraine will not be a liability for the EU, but will be very quickly an asset for the EU. It's clear that at the beginning, when Ukraine will join the EU, this will have a huge impact on the EU budget, on a number of policies, such as the Common Agricultural Policy or the Cohesion Policy. It will have as well some impact on the decision-making process, because when you go from 27 to 35, it's clear that you have more heterogeneity, and therefore it's more difficult to reach a consensus when you have to take a decision. But we have to explain that, first of all, the EU has to be reformed regardless of Ukraine accession, because already today the EU cannot take some decision in major policy areas such as the migration and asylum policy, because you have countries like Hungary which block everything. First point. Second point, all serious people know today that the budget of the EU has to be revised and that we need additional resources, own resources and or joint borrowing. We know that. And we know as well that it would be good to adapt some of the existing policies, such as the Common Agricultural Policy, to the new environment we have, especially regarding climate change and the loss of biodiversity. And therefore, we have to explain that it's not because of Ukraine joining the EU that the EU has to be reformed. The EU has to be reformed without taking into consideration Ukraine. First point. And second point, we should explain that Ukraine's accession should not be hostage to the EU reform, and EU member states should not to block Ukraine EU membership, block the reform of the EU. And therefore, this is the second point. And the third point, we have to explain that if in the first years after Ukraine accession, there will be a huge impact on the EU budget, and in the medium term, Ukraine will be an asset. And I'm sure, but when I say that here, people believe that I am crazy or that I took cocaine, but I'm sure that Ukraine will become quickly a net contributor to the EU, because Ukraine has an unbelievable potential. Ukraine is not a poor country which will remain poor for decades, and which will be which will need EU funding for much time. Ukraine has an unbelievable potential in all sectors, and if we manage through Ukraine accession to the EU and through an effective reconstruction and recovery effort, if we manage to unleash, to unblock this social, economic, and political potential of Ukraine, Ukraine will very quickly become an asset for the EU. And I have not mentioned the area where Ukraine will be a fantastic asset, security. Ukraine will be, now in the EU, everybody, even in Western Europe, start to understand that the Putin regime is a threat, even for Western Europe. Not everything understand this, but more and more people understand this. You see the evolution of in the speeches of the French president 2 years
For
ago
sure.
was saying and was saying now. Bon. And therefore, we have to explain that Ukraine will be the security pillar for the EU on its eastern flank, and that Ukraine will be a security hub with a fantastic high-tech defense industry Ukraine has already got. Look at the kind of drones that Ukraine is producing and all the equipment that the Ukrainians have been able to produce. In the field of economic security, same thing. You know, the Commission has set out a list of 30 critical materials for the EU, economic security. Ukraine has deposits for 22 of these 30 critical minerals. You can imagine what this means the day that EU companies will be able to invest, to ramp up, to boost the production of these critical materials in Ukraine. In an area such as information technology, Ukraine is the second country on the continent after Estonia. So Ukraine can bring a lot to the EU market. And therefore, we have to fight this ideological battle and to explain that, contrary to what many Western European politicians and so-called intellectuals say today, Ukraine will not be a liability, but an asset for the EU. This is a very difficult battle, but we have good arguments to have this fight.
And we already see that some things that we thought are impossible several years ago are already history today. So definitely, who's knocking on the door will be capable of getting that door opened. And I hope that we will be able to persuade Europe that, yes, Ukraine could be helping for Europe, for example, get rid of some of the dependencies, as you were mentioning, with regard to some of the critical materials, and could also be an asset in some other fields. But we need to ensure that this is getting through to the societies and the methodology, or mythology rather, coming and propaganda coming from the Russian Federation and elsewhere would not take it over. From your perspective, dear Hüဃ, what would our speed of movement towards the goal of European integration and joining the EU, what would it depend upon? What would be the major kind of pillars to which we have to pay attention?
There are, Ivana, three main criteria which determine the pace of accession talks. Political will of the leadership of the country. Second one, the competence of the public administration, which will negotiate the taking over of the acquis. And third point, the state of the public opinion as reflected by the civil society organizations. And on these three areas, Ukraine is in a very, very, very good situation if I compare Ukraine with any other EU candidate country. There is no doubt about that. Because as regards the political will of the leadership, what I have seen in Ukraine between 2014 and 2022, I cannot see any other candidate country where the political leadership was so much willing to join the EU. And not only to enter the supermarket, as some people say in Western Europe, but because Ukrainians want their children to live in the kind of open society we have in Western Europe, in the EU. So the determination of the political leadership was there, without any doubt. The competence of the public officials, well, as you know, Ivana, I have been spending, I don't know how many hours with some ministries and some Verovna Rada committees talking about the implementation of the DCFTA. And here again, you have extremely competent people in Ukraine. And therefore, you have the possibility to move ahead in the accession talks quickly, because technically you can overcome rather easily, in my humble view, the technical obstacles. And as regards the public opinion, well, the Ukrainians have been telling since 2004, when they elected Yushchenko, that they wanted to get in the EU, to have an open society with a social market economy. You have in Ukraine the most vibrant civil society I have seen in the whole EU neighborhood. And therefore, here again, if your civil society is well involved in the accession negotiation in the right way, no doubt that you have fantastic assets. And therefore, for me, Ukraine should be able to move ahead quickly when it comes to the accession talks. I don't believe at all that it does make any sense to say, like some political leaders said, in 20 years, the Western Balkans did not manage to close 3 chapters out of 33, so it will take decades for Ukraine to. Does not make any sense. In my view, the reference point should be a country like Lithuania. Lithuania, they started the negotiation in mid-99. They completed the negotiation in mid-2002, 3 years. You see?
Well, that's pretty optimistic.
No, I'm not telling you that it will take 3 years to Ukraine. I just said that for me, this should be for you the reference point, because you have all elements to move ahead quickly, at least before the war. What will happen? I don't know. But
yeah, that's another big question mark, how and when the war will end. And we hope that it will end with our victory, and hopefully as soon as possible. But definitely that will be also a big player in this transformation and our ability to move fast. But from your, you've been giving a very positive assessment of all the things that have been happening here in Ukraine in terms of transformation, in terms of civil society, engagement of different stakeholders. But from your knowledge of Ukraine, what would be the most difficult areas? Which would be the most difficult areas for transformation for Ukraine in this European accession process?
The areas where I believe that with the Russian full-scale invasion, Ukraine will have difficulties are mainly, in my view, demography and environment. Demography, because Ukraine had a rather negative demographic trajectory. When Ukraine became independent in December 1991, you were 52 millions, 52. Before the Russian full-scale invasion, the estimates was between 38 and 40 million. And we know that in 2022, just after the invasion, 8 million Ukrainians left the country. Alors, some of them went back. We don't know exactly, but for sure, between 5 and 8 million Ukrainians are still abroad. And you have at least 6 million Ukrainians which moved from the eastern and the central part to the western part. And therefore, it will not be easy to get these people back home. And this is why it is very important to ensure that in the reconstruction process, the basic needs of the population determine the priorities, namely, first, how to handle the environmental devastation of the country, which has a lot of impact on the health of the population. This will not be easy because what the Russians have been doing is really an ecocide. Not only the most spectacular one, like the dam on the Dnipro River, which was blown up, but we know that a large part of the territory, at least 100,000 square kilometers, is full of mines and unexploded ordnances. So it will not be easy to clear these lands and therefore to get people back there. Then we know that the Russians have been bombing since 2014 a number of steel and chemical industries, a number of power plants as well. So I can imagine the level of asbestos which has been disseminated when I think of Mariupol and what happened to the Illich and Azovstal steel companies. God, the people who today are living there, I cannot imagine for the children what they are
breathing in
their lungs. Avdiivka, recently we talk a lot about Avdiivka when the Russians have been, I remember that I went there the first time in 2016 and already at that time the Russians were bombing the coke factory. Same thing, you can imagine the, so demography, necessity as well to really handle this ecological, environmental devastation of the country, the basic infrastructure, obviously, people need electricity, heating, water, healthcare services and schools, otherwise they will not get back to their region of origin. And you will have as well in some part of Ukraine a very fragmented society because some people took weapons to fight the Russian invader. Other people stay there and had to live with the occupation forces. And some people left. And when all these people will get back together, it will be necessary to build a new social fabric, as we say now, and to strengthen the social cohesion of these people. So these are areas where, in my view, we should focus when we implement the reconstruction program and when we negotiate as well the Ukraine accession. We should keep in mind that Ukraine will have to face these very, very difficult challenges.
Well, I'm assuming that you are also referring now to your experience while working in this European Agency for Reconstruction when you were dealing with the post-war recovery of Serbia, Kosovo, Montenegro, and Macedonia, well, not now, Northern Macedonia. And I understand that already then there was probably this attempt to connect the European vocation of many of those countries with the recovery effort. And we have talked about this Balkan trap. So how to ensure that, approach to recovery of Ukraine, reconstruction of Ukraine, is closely connected to this European integration track and how to ensure that they are reinforcing each other and not actually complicating one or another process.
You see, when I look at the Ukraine plan that Prime Minister Shmyhal handed over to the Commission 2 weeks ago, the Ukraine plan will allow Ukraine to get over the next 4 years the 50 billions that the EU has earmarked for Ukraine reconstruction and recovery. When I look at this plan, I see as the priority sectors, the sectors which in fact are in the fundamentals cluster for the EU accession talk. You get a reform of the public administration, improvement of public finance management, fight against corruption, all the areas where basically Ukraine has to move ahead under the fundamental cluster in the accession, and at the same time, which will be priority sector in the Ukraine plan for the reconstruction and the recovery of the process. So there is a coincidence, in my view, which has been well perceived by the Ukrainians when they drew up the Ukrainian plan for reconstruction and recovery, and when they approach the accession talks. The second point is that in the Ukraine plan, you have a lot of reforms, priority reforms, which correspond exactly with what you have to do in the accession talks, and which will facilitate the alignment of the Ukrainian legislation with the EU acquis. And therefore, in my view, up to now, there has been a very good link which has been associated between the Ukraine plan for reconstruction and recovery and the beginning of the accession talks with a focus on the so-called fundamentals. There is a good connection, and I'm sure that the Ukrainian will be able to manage that in the right way, because they know all these things.
Well, that's again a optimistic and hopeful message for Ukrainians as well, and understanding from the European side. I think that conditionality that was kind of suggested from the European Commission side was actually included into this plan. So hopefully it will work out in that direction as you are seeing it. But I must ask you one question that has created a lot of headache and tension lately between us and our closest partners and our dear neighbors, for example, Polish colleagues who have, from the very beginning of the full-scale invasion, have been showing incredible support to Ukraine. But now we are seeing new waves of blocking of the Ukrainian borders, either by lorry drivers or from Poland, or by agricultural workers like farmers from Poland. And we understand that this is connected to an extent to this autonomous trade preferences that we received during the war. But at the same time, we also understand that we have seen something very similar towards Polish farmers when Poland was joining the EU on behalf of French or German farmers or lorry drivers and so on. So my question is how to find and look for those compromises acceptable for both sides, but on different stages. One, during the war, and secondly, when we hopefully after the war will be just dealing with our, joining the agricultural market in this particular area as a nation.
Ivana, you are totally right, and it's clear that once Ukraine has completed the accession talks in some sectors and we join the EU market, you will have, in a number of sectors, in some EU countries, people who will say, you cannot open like that our market, otherwise we will just disappear. We cannot stand the competition with Ukraine because there is a social dumping and blah, blah, blah. Bon. And therefore, Ukraine, to be realistic, will have to negotiate transitional periods. And we'll have to say, we have trade liberalization in the agricultural sector because now we are in the EU single market, but we understand that in some sectors such as poultry, honey, maize, I don't know where, it will take 2 years, 3 years, or 5 years to get full access to the EU market without any customs duties or quantitative restrictions. You will have to accept transitional periods. This happened with the countries which joined the EU in 2004 and 2007, and I'm sure that it will happen with Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia. Access to the labor market, same thing. It will take some time. So you have to already reflect on that, try to understand where the EU will be extremely cautious, and already try to elaborate a negotiating position for transitional periods in sensitive sectors. This is how I would approach this issue.
And that's where we would have to agree here internally what are the minimum conditions that we are ready to accept and how to move from there.
Yeah.
I think we both understand that we are still, even though so many years and so many efforts are behind of us, we are still at the at least middle of this path. And we are really hoping and counting that those friends of ours, like yourself, will not get tired of advising, of sometimes pushing, helping us with arguments, teaching, and maybe also learning along the way together with us, as I'm sure is also happening.
Ivana, how can we get tired? You have been fighting for 10 years now, a war for your freedom and for the freedom of Europeans, for us as well. How can we be tired to try to assist you and to get you in our family? So,
I just want more of this Hüဃ Мінґареллі all over.
Sorry?
I just want to see more of this Hüဃ Мінґарelлі all over.
But you will have more and more people when they get really informed about the tragedy that you are living and the heroic way in which the Ukrainians are facing this tragedy. You will have more and more people, even in Western Europe, who will understand that you are a fantastic people, and it would be an honor and a privilege for us to have Ukraine in the EU family.
Well, thank you. Thank you for your belief. Thank you for your efforts, and hope that we will get there together.
Слава Україні!
Героям слава! Друзі, дякуємо, що залишаєтеся з нами на нашому каналі ЄвроSapiens. Ставте вподобайки, коментуйте, пропонуйте, критикуйте. А я вам бажаю, бережіть себе і до нової зустрічі.